Welcome to day 2 of I4C. Today's plenary is being held in collaboration with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and we're going to be focusing on carbon pricing and the role it will play in the transition to net zero. We hope to showcase those who are driving decarbonisation efforts, and we're going to be hearing from leaders around the world representing governments, corporations and civil society. If you've just joined us today, then I encourage you to complete your profile on the website. It's going to help you make the most of your networking opportunities. And you can also sign up to the workshop sessions. There are plenty to choose from, let me tell you. So make sure you check out the agenda and drop into the marketplace while you're about it, where you'll be able to connect with innovative startups and entrepreneurs. And we would also really love you to join in the discussion, and you can do that via the community page. Oh, and do tag us on social media, why don't you? Just use the hashtag #InnovateForClimate. If you have any queries at all during this event, you can contact the help desk using the live chat function. So, to our opening session for today, I am delighted to welcome Bernice van Bronkhorst, the Global Director for the Climate Change Group at the World Bank. Bernice, it's over to you.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you to all of you that have taken the time to join us here today. On behalf of the World Bank Group, I'd like to welcome you to the second day of this year's Innovate for Climate conference. My name is Bernice van Bronkhorst. I am the Director of the Climate Change Group here at the World Bank. Today's plenary on putting a price on carbon to reach net zero is hosted in partnership with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, better known as the CPLC, of course, and we are proud hosts of the CPLC Secretariat here in the World Bank. I don't need to tell this group, of course, how important carbon pricing can be as a policy to help countries achieve green, resilient and inclusive growth. Many of you are involved in shaping and implementing the over 60 emission trading systems and carbon taxes systems that are operating across almost 80 countries and subnational jurisdictions today. Many of you are also supporting other countries as they consider the role of international carbon markets to meet their NDCs. So let me really therefore start with a very sincere thank you for all you're doing to help make these policies implementable, robust and successful. I'm very proud of the trusted and respected role that the CPLC has played in building support for carbon pricing. It's really played a critical role over the last 6 years in terms of building the evidence base to make a strong case for a price on carbon. It's really helped in deepening an understanding of this economic case. And lastly, its really main role has been in facilitating meaningful and substantive dialogues between government and business leadership to tackle pressing issues and to address them. Today, 6 years on from its launch, the CPLC is the one-stop shop to support carbon pricing action, helping build government capacity, link markets, and scale up climate finance. Through its technical expertise and convening power, it provides a platform to share best-in-class expertise and also tough lessons, inspiring others to follow suit and increase the adoption of carbon pricing. Last year's report prepared by the CPLC's Task Force on Net Zero Goals and Carbon Pricing emphasized that carbon pricing, including international cooperation through carbon markets, should be included in the arsenal of measures to enable achievement to net zero targets. Really a very important tool in our toolkit. Today's plenary marks the launch of CPLC's annual leadership report, which highlights examples of leadership in the field of carbon pricing to inspire governments, business leaders, and other stakeholders from around the world to use carbon pricing as a tool for sustainable development. So I'm really looking forward to hearing today from some of these leaders on how they see carbon pricing and markets playing a role to deliver on net zero, how they are turning ambition into action, specifically from their perspectives, from their different contexts that they're coming from. So for those watching online, do please join the conversation on social media using hashtag #InnovateForClimate. And please, feel free to raise questions and, of course, spread the word. So with that, back to you, Anita, and thank you very much for inviting me here today.
Thank you very much, Bernice van Bronkhorst. We move now to our keynote speaker, Emmanuel Nyirinkindi. Now, Emmanuel is the Vice President of Cross-Cutting Solutions at the International Finance Corporation. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Anita. Greetings from the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group, focusing on the private sector in emerging markets. My name is Emmanuel Nyirinkindi, and I'm I4C's Vice President for Cross-Cutting Solutions, which oversees I4C's climate work. Today's discussion is on carbon pricing. This is a powerful tool in the toolbox of policies and initiatives to help countries and companies achieve their net zero goals. And as my colleague Bernice just pointed out, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition has been quite impactful in building government capacity and in scaling up climate finance. The numbers speak for themselves. Today, 65 carbon pricing initiatives have been implemented worldwide. This sends a clear signal that those who generate greenhouse gas emissions must take responsibility for reducing them, while those who reduce them will be rewarded. The private sector is taking note. Currently, over 2,000 companies representing $27 trillion of market capitalization are already using or are planning to use a carbon price by the end of 2022. Compare that to just 150 companies in 2014. Why is the private sector voluntarily stepping up? First, it's what the market expects. Increasingly, investors and consumers are looking for a clear picture of how companies manage their climate risk. Second, implementing carbon pricing now allows companies to prepare for regulations in places that don't yet have them, and for more stringent regulations in places that already do. Third, companies are using carbon pricing to seize the opportunity to invest in climate projects and develop low carbon products and processes. Take, for example, Canada's TD Bank, which embarked on a carbon neutrality initiative and uses an internal carbon price to develop new financial products. These include a $500 million green bond, insurance for hybrid and electric vehicles, and also new financing for clean energy. In Turkey, Guarantee Bank was the first local bank to commit to a carbon price in the shape of a fixed forestation fee for carbon-intensive project finance transactions. We are pleased that carbon credits are trading at a multiple of what they were only 1 year ago. Volumes have increased dramatically. Demand rapidly outpaces supply. And as the market grows, investors are placing greater emphasis on the quality of credits. Investor demand is particularly strong for removal credits that come from removing greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere, such as direct air capture or reforestation. Today, voluntary markets are at a critical juncture. While COP26 established basic rules for a global carbon credit market, many details have yet to be worked out, and they are. It is critical that the global community endorses the definitive rules to govern well-functioning carbon markets, and investors have told us at the I4C that clarity and transparency are key. We must therefore ensure that markets deliver genuine and cost-effective decarbonization and also avoid greenwashing. Ultimately, these markets will be fundamental to driving greenhouse gas emissions reductions. At the I4C, we are committed fully to helping voluntary carbon markets to mature, and we are working with our partners and our clients to expand them. Efforts include investing in projects to develop quality carbon credits, which requires working on new carbon credit methodologies that will finance new technologies, such as green hydrogen or long-term batteries. Now we'll hear from leaders who are pushing this agenda forward. They bring diverse and rich voices to the carbon pricing discussion, and they're all committed to making sure this important tool achieves our shared goal of accelerating the green transition. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you all agree, a really insightful keynote there from Emmanuel Nyirinkindi, which leads us beautifully into our Leadership Voices series. We're going to be hearing from some special guests in just a moment, including Dirk Forrester, President and CEO of the International Trading Emissions Association, and Swee Chen Go, President of Global Compact Network Singapore. But first, our Leadership Voices series. So this first is entitled The Role of Carbon Pricing in the Transition to Net Zero. We asked our contributors to answer this question: how are you using carbon pricing to support your net zero target? And here's what they had to say.
My name is Pennelope Beckles. I am the Minister of Planning and Development from Trinidad and Tobago.
My name is Guilbeault, Minister of the Environment and Climate Change for Canada.
My name is Marta Martínez. I work for Iberdrola, based in Madrid.
My name is Mandy Rambros. I am the General Manager in the Office of the Group Chief Executive of Eskom Holdings.
Hello, this is Carmen Navarro, the Managing Director of the Spanish Green Growth Group. I'm from Madrid.
Carbon pricing is helping us in our pathway to become a net zero company in 2040 and to achieve our interim targets of reducing our Scope 1 and 2 emissions up to 80% in 2030. Also to neutralize our Scope 1 and 2 emissions in our main markets since 2025. But how are we going to implement it? On one hand, we are including a shadow carbon price to reduce Scope 1 emissions that are generated from the use of fuel and refrigerant gases. This tool allows us to guide the investment decisions of our procurement processes toward the most carbon-efficient technologies and equipment that represent a lower carbon footprint. On the other hand, we are introducing an internal carbon fee that will help us to establish a carbon fund that is fit by the processes of this carbon price, and that could be used to finance carbon removal projects to neutralize our residual emissions, around 10% starting in 2025. Giving a price to carbon is not only a great lever of our decarbonization plan, but also a useful financial tool for risk management and investment processes.
It is widely accepted that carbon pricing is an increasingly cost-effective mechanism for incentivizing and discouraging what is now free carbon pollution. Carbon and greenhouse gases are major pollutants that are causing climate change, which is considered to be the greatest threat to mankind. Carbon pricing is also aligned with the polluters pay principle that underpins environmental law, and which is also the premise on which Trinidad and Tobago's environmental policy and laws are based. Trinidad and Tobago is committed to comprehensively addressing climate change and its obligations under the Paris Agreement in striving to net zero by the second half of this century. Achieving net zero emissions not only contributes to the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but also fulfilling Trinidad and Tobago's national priorities outlined in National Development Strategy Vision 2030 under Theme 5, placing the environment at the center of social and economic development while also attaining SDG 13 climate change. Our long-term mitigation strategy targets continuous deviation from a business-as-usual baseline toward eventual carbon neutrality. Carbon pricing may have potential for deploying clean and emission-reducing technology in the major emitting sectors such as power generation, industry and transportation, which are included in our National Determined Contribution, NDC. It can also increase opportunities for businesses to participate in carbon markets through cap-and-trade schemes and thereby incentivize mitigation ambition.
Since 2019, our country has had a price on carbon pollution from coast to coast to coast. Our approach is designed to make life affordable while growing a clean economy. We use the proceeds to benefit Canadians, their families, communities, and businesses. La tarification de la pollution au Canada est également une approche souple qui peut être adaptée. Ce sont différents systèmes de tarification adaptés en fonction des économies locales qui s'appliquent dans les différentes régions du pays. Under the federal fuel charge, the government delivers lump sum payments called climate incentive payments to households in different provinces such as Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, with 8 out of 10 households receiving more than they pay through carbon pricing. Lower-income households in particular benefit the most. Carbon pricing, combined with other climate policies, is driving an industrial transformation in Canada. Companies are improving their efficiency and investing in clean technologies. The government has set an ambitious goal of 40 to 45% greenhouse gas reduction from 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. Carbon pricing is a cornerstone policy to get us there. It is efficient, affordable, and can be customized to fit the circumstances. D'autres pays dans le monde constatent des résultats semblables. C'est pourquoi le Canada encourage tous les pays à envisager l'adoption d'une tarification de la pollution. We've in fact issued a challenge to triple the global emissions covered by carbon pricing by 2030. It's an ambitious goal, but we're ready to work together to make it happen.
Carbon pricing is a necessary tool to provide a cost-efficient economic signal to investment and consumption, and create a level playing field over competing energy carriers. Additionally, it can promote the innovation to expand technological frontiers and scale solutions in hard-to-abate sectors. Integrating carbon pricing into ambitious climate approaches is key in the definition of a robust pathway to a net zero economy.
What's very important from a carbon pricing perspective is that without the stick of carbon penalties or for price on carbon, and without the incentive of we can actually decarbonize the globe through incentivizing a price on carbon, this value proposition would not have held up at COP26. So putting a price on carbon is extremely important. But what's also important is working in concert together with global funders and utilities and companies such as ourselves, where we all have the same goal of decarbonization while ensuring that we have a positive impact on socioeconomic development and on increasing jobs. And by working in concert with funders, with companies, with like-minded countries, is how we can act now and how we can act more.
The Spanish Green Growth Group is a business alliance of over 50 companies of different sizes and sectors, public and private, fully committed to climate action and addressing environmental challenges. We believe carbon pricing plays a key role in the transition to a decarbonized economy and fight against climate change. Public infrastructure and standards are also required in order to effectively decarbonize, but price signals are essential to provide the right indications to investors and consumers. When it is integrated into a broader package of climate action measures, it can incentivize sectoral transformations, align investments to decarbonize the economy, scale up carbon removals, and spur innovation in greenhouse gas mitigation technologies and practices. Currently, around 45 large Spanish companies apply carbon pricing, several of them members of the Spanish Green Growth Group. Here we have Acciona, Iberdrola, IAG, Banco Santander, BBVA, CaixaBank, Ferrovial, Mafre, Enagas, Endesa, Logista, and Naturgy.
Well, listening to that is Dirk Forrester, President and CEO of the International Trading Emissions Association, and Svichen Go, President of Global Compact Network, Singapore. Welcome to you both. Dirk, if I may go to you first. Let's talk about the role and potential of carbon pricing and carbon markets, shall we? Because the aim is to support the achievement of net zero targets and decarbonisation strategies for countries and businesses. But the big question is, how do you go about that?
Well, frankly, I think you can go about it in a variety of ways, and that's been one of the real benefits of work that the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition has done over the past several years, is to highlight that it's not a one-size-fits-all, but certainly the dominant approach is with cap-and-trade programs, but there are a variety of other carbon pricing programs, carbon tax and offset programs, but they all have to be attuned to that net zero goal that you mentioned. And I think the effectiveness of them is really driven by the strength of the target that the country sets. What I think is really interesting over the past couple of years is that more and more companies are setting their own net zero targets so that they are aligned with where government policy is going. And those voluntary commitments are becoming substantial because they're driven by customer preferences, they're driven by investors, and also driven by the expectations of what policymakers are going to want in the future. I think the main thing to remember is that to get to net zero, carbon pricing will be essential because it drives value. It's the thing that highlights that emission reductions have value. And it puts a price on those things. And it enables companies to plan and to chart their own transition. So I think it's essential and it's valuable.
Sweet and Go, if I may throw the same question to you. I mean, does that experience from Dirk reflect your own experience?
Yeah, I would say very much along the same lines. In the past years, what I have seen is a marked shift in societies and nations, countries' attitudes towards sustainability, especially in emissions. And we all know through the IPCC report that was released in 2021 that the world would have to cut global emissions by half by the year 2030 in order to achieve net zero by the year 2050. And while many corporations and countries have actually pledged net zero by the year 2050, how to get there is really far from clear. Dirk has also talked about carbon pricing and the carbon market and the important role that it plays in achieving decarbonization strategies. And I do agree wholeheartedly with that. As we speak, assets are being repriced to include carbon and climate-related factors. And also, it would also it needs to be also be planned well as we transition to net zero. And when planned well, decarbonization activities could actually boost growth. And I want to bring the example here in Singapore with the introduction of carbon tax in the year 2019. When carbon tax was introduced, it was at $5 a ton. Businesses were given a lot of notice and opportunities to consider the impact and the implication, and therefore its actions, and the use of that tax being redeployed, recycled on innovations in these companies and new sectors as well.
That experience in Singapore may be very instructive. Do stay with us, and Dirk too, because I'd love you to hear the next in our series of Leadership Voices, where we consider carbon pricing across business. So the question we asked our contributors this time was, how are you implementing carbon pricing across your business? Let's hear from them now.
Hello, I'm Maggie Anderson, Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer at Holcim, based in Switzerland.
I'm Mahendra Singhi, CEO of Dalmia Cement from India.
My name is Vito Saluto. I am the head of ESG for EMEA Power. I'm Italian.
Hello, everyone. My name is Valentina Alfaya, Sustainability Director at Ferrovial.
My name is Shamini Harrington. I'm the VP Climate Change at Sasol, a large integrated energy and chemicals company in South Africa.
At Holcim, we have been supporting the work of the World Bank Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, or CPLC, for many years now, for a very simple reason. Carbon pricing plays an absolute fundamental role in our net zero journey. When we look at it from the full value chain perspective, in one hand, we have the supply chain, and it's a central element of the business cases to invest at scale. For example, when we want to replace fossil fuels by waste in our alternative fuel strategy. But also from the demand side, the price of carbon, if embedded in products, will overcome the green premium and create demand for low carbon solutions. So carbon pricing across value chain will facilitate the technological shift that is needed to transform our economy at scales and reach 1.5 degree objective.
We have created our carbon negative roadmap 2040, considering many initiatives. And one of the initiatives was to adopt internal pricing of carbon. In fact, if we look back, we find that many projects which have made big impact on bringing down our CO2 emissions in cement process were helped by certain projects which we could execute by taking internal pricing of carbon. If we would not have done that, it was difficult to convince ourselves, our board, and the stakeholders.
AMIA Power is a Dubai-based independent developer, owner, and operator of renewable energy projects with a primary focus on Africa, Middle East, and emerging Asia. Our mission of developing renewable energy projects is supported by carbon pricing. The voluntary carbon markets play a key role on allowing clean and competitive power in developing countries. Producing steel, as you know, is one of the most emission-intensive activities in the supply chain, and in opposite, producing carbon steel can increase the steelmaker's cost significantly by as much as 50% in some cases. Unfortunately, this can be challenging for businesses like our AMIA Power, who outsource and whose supply chain might be not fully transparent with their monitoring, measurement, and reporting. Across our supply chain, as AMIA Power, we are trying to do an enormous effort on minimizing the carbon emission linked to our activities. In particular, we try to abide by the green supply chain and the sustainability pillars, mainly environmental, social, economical factors. Practically translate on imposing strong requirements to our supply chain, either upstream or downstream, in terms of ESG compliance. One of these includes to integrate emission metrics in procurement standards and track the performances. There is, however, a long way to further decarbonize the supply chain of renewable energy industry. Generally speaking, we see how the industry at large is still not ready to meet the market requirements in terms of volume price of these low carbon goods. For us as AMIA Power, carbon pricing definitely will play an important role on supporting our mission of providing clean and competitive power across developing countries. And we also believe that the carbon prices will be a cornerstone for further supporting the decarbonization of our supply chain and our projects.
An intensive carbon portfolio is considered also as risky for future business performance and growth in every kind of corporation. In that context, a proper climate strategy should be supported by adequate management tools in order to manage efficiently the intensity of the current and future portfolios. In our opinion, internal carbon pricing is one of the key elements for such a challenging purpose. This tool, in the case of Ferrovial, has been delivered since 2018 to implement a carbon price on Ferrovial's most relevant investments as a shadow pricing modality, introducing the carbon price in the internal rate of return in order to monetize the associated risks and opportunities for new investments and provide information for making proper decisions.
We are undertaking a fundamental transformation of our business called Future Sasol. We are aiming to achieve a 30% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. Future Sasol focuses on decarbonizing while preserving and growing value. Our transition will follow a gradual approach to minimize social and economic impacts. We are implementing a mix of energy and process efficiencies, investing in large-scale renewables, shifting to incremental transition natural gas, and growing and utilizing green hydrogen. Green hydrogen will allow us to achieve our fossil fuel-free vision and zero Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Green hydrogen can help tackle various critical energy challenges and is the pathway of choice to decarbonize sectors such as long-haul transport, heavy-duty mobility, chemicals, and the iron and steel industry. The scale at which Sasol can eventually deploy green hydrogen is substantial. With a conducive market and enabling policy environment, Sasol could be the anchor for developing and localizing important value chains in the country, creating jobs and lowering the costs for the benefit of all South Africans. It is against this backdrop that we believe that setting an appropriate price on carbon is a critical part of the suite of policy interventions required to achieve the transition and the Paris Agreement goal. A stable and predictable carbon price that recognizes the need for flexibility through incentives and subsidies is required to deliver on any climate goal.
So really great to hear from our contributors in this, the second of our series of leadership videos. Let's go back, though, to Dirk and Sweetchen to hear their thoughts. And Sweetchen, if I may start with you this time, how can carbon pricing be used to decarbonise the supply chain? Maybe you might be able to share some of the trends that have been working for you.
You know, supply chain have actually long been a lever that is used to sway behaviors and outcomes. And so, therefore, it is not a surprise that it has become a focus for suppliers looking for value creation in ESG offerings, or companies and consumers deploying purchasing powers to achieve ESG goals and specifically decarbonization impacts. The starting basis for GCNS is to start building capability in carbon reporting. We feel that companies need to get a good grip on their carbon liabilities from supply chain. But measuring supply chain emissions is complex, and a good map of the supply chain to understand product flows and collaborations with suppliers all play an increasingly important role for net zero ambition. And this is where we have started work with the maritime sector in walking them through and building capabilities in reporting. The other one is in the build sector. And we all know that building generates about 40% of the annual global CO2 emissions, of which 28% comes from operations and the remaining 11% comes from materials. And we know that we cannot offset away emissions with carbon credits, and therefore efficiency in energy consumption, innovation in low carbon building materials gives us opportunities to translate to green lease offerings and also ESG investment products.
I mean, it's not a simple picture. You're making that very clear. Dirk, to you, I mean, how effective is carbon pricing for driving down emissions from energy-intensive industries and those hard-to-abate sectors?
I think the effectiveness of it is often in the strength of the regulation that's set up to drive it, right? And in a cap and trade system, it's all about the stringency of the cap and how tightly that cap declines over time to net zero. And that sends a pricing signal to hard-to-abate sectors that I think is vitally important, because certainly right now in the European Union, as an example, you can see a forward price curve out over several years. You can know how to plan against that. You also have a compliance obligation this year that means that emission reductions are worth on the order of 90 euros a ton. So that's a serious driver for many energy intensive sectors. But they're also cash constrained, right? Many businesses are, and they're constrained by challenges in their own supply chains that were being described just now. And I think that what I tend to see happening is that companies are using the flexibility of the trading system to chart their own pathway forward. That's the big difference in a trading model versus a command and control model. Is in a command and control policy model, the government tells you precisely what to do, and it may be a static thing where they tell you something and there's an innovation that they don't capture for several years. Whereas in a market system, you've got the ability to decide what makes sense in your own energy intensive industry and to do what makes sense to get your business to that point. So it gives you a lot more flexibility. But the incentives of the system do work. And importantly, I think many of the trading markets that have been established and the tax and offset systems are providing revenue to the governments that they can then use for innovation funds, for example, that would help to drive down the cost of new technologies for some of their covered industries. So they can also be used to blunt the impacts on low-income communities to help the political acceptability of the program. So I do think that the systems are effective, and we're especially seeing that in places that have these strong caps. But we're also seeing it in tax systems that are sending that powerful pricing incentive that is helping companies chart their way forward.
And this is all so interesting. Please do stay with us. Don't go away, because I want to get some more of your thoughts in a moment. First, though, I want us all to have a look at this third in our Leadership Voices series. This time we asked, how can we use carbon pricing to scale up carbon markets and channel finance towards decarbonisation?
My name is Mikkel Larsen. I'm joining you here from Singapore. I'm the CEO of Climate Impact X.
I'm Karen Fang, the Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Bank of America.
My name is Fenella Awan, and I'm speaking to you from London.
We are currently running out of time to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We need to reduce emissions by 45% from 2010 levels in 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Article 6, agreed upon in COP26, can help move finance quickly from developed countries to emerging economies. Voluntary carbon offsets, if done well, can help raise finance needed for many projects, while cap and trade systems provide clear strategies for companies to reduce emissions. The EU is also planning to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which could entice other regions to do the same. Trillions of dollars are needed to be invested to reach a net zero world, and carbon pricing mechanisms could reduce emissions and help us unlock the finance needed to decarbonize.
Carbon markets have already shown to be the scalable solution to drive corporate finance to stop deforestation. Wildlife Works has seen incredible growth as our clients recognize the importance of our commitment to ensure their finance goes directly to forest communities. Higher carbon prices will accelerate decarbonization of our clients and make more funds available for natural climate solutions. Higher carbon prices will also make sure that more places are viable for natural climate solutions from developers like Wildlife Works.
Carbon pricing is an essential tool to put a price on the externalities that climate change imposes on us. And within that toolbox, there are many different tools. One of the essential ones are voluntary carbon market. And they're unique in at least 4 different ways. First of all, when they're done right, they allow money to flow to those countries, to those project developers who can solve the problems at the cheapest, the best possible price. Secondly, what they do is they create essential income for preserving some of these carbon sinks that we have today. And that's much more important than just providing finance. Thirdly, they provide a long-term solution for preserving these sinks. Even when the world has decarbonized, we still need these things to stay in place. We have no other ways of doing that. And fourth, and perhaps for me, what I'm most passionate about, they do so much more for nature than just helping us with climate change. They address also the equally big problems of biodiversity loss, and they create local employment and livelihoods of local communities. And for all these reasons, we don't have a better solution right now. So we should get behind the voluntary carbon market and make sure that they work well.
I think if global carbon markets can converge more based on standardized operating principles and metrics, we could hope to arrive at a benchmark price of carbon removal from the atmosphere. It helps provide more transparent comparisons between the cost to neutralize carbon emissions from carbon-emitting activities and the cost to generate cleaner alternatives that are currently still priced at a green premium. In other words, when investors compare investment in carbon-intensive companies, the carbon market-generated carbon price can be incorporated to evaluate the true return on investment. This will help level the playing field with regards to other investments in greener and cleaner companies. Although the scale and cost still presents a massive challenge today, the carbon removal cost is much less or non-existent. We need more transparent pricing of carbon from global compliance and voluntary carbon markets to make this relative value comparison easier for investors and governments. It can help stimulate and catalyze more scalable decarbonization investment in both nature-based and engineered solutions.
At GGGI, we are actively working with our member governments to help them get ready to participate in international carbon markets under Article 6. We see the markets developing to not only allow the private sector to participate in national trading schemes, but also in the international compliance markets. A linking, if you like, of the voluntary markets to national policies and commitments. This way, we can ensure that any trading is above and beyond the national commitments made by governments, and therefore are pushing ambition further. Ultimately, the aim is for a single global price for carbon. A logical development pathway, we believe, to get there is to create as many markets as we can now. National, international, voluntary, compliance. and then allow them to naturally simplify and merge over time.
So again, listening to all of that attentively, we have Dirk and Svi Chen. Svi Chen, just tell us what role the financial sector can play to incentivise decarbonisation. How can carbon markets help unlock private finance and support the decarbonisation efforts of companies and economies?
I actually don't think carbon trades it's the major lever to unlock private finance. I think market forces and societal attitudes and preferences would play a major role in changing the investment landscape to lower carbon to lower carbon sectors, including green technologies. And we've seen over the past decades, assets under management in dedicated ESG funds have tripled to about $1 trillion. And we've seen financial sectors actually jumping into the bandwagon. But markets are truly a long way away from fully pricing the consequences of climate challenges and society attitudes towards sustainability. And I also wanted to just say that there is a lack of data that is linked to sustainability, and this makes it hard to quantify the investment impact as well. However, all this should not stop us. It is not for us a question of will net zero happen, but just how and what does it mean to the asset portfolio in order for us to transition to a net zero portfolio. And long-term investors and the financial sector would also need to consider climate implications on their portfolio. And what they need to take into account would be things such as what are the transition readiness of their portfolio and how could they steward the desired outcomes through either their corporate actions or shareholder votes. And there is much needed emphasis also on improving tools that would better measure and provide better analytics of data for sustainability impacts. And ESG data will become more and more of a common language amongst issuers and amongst investors. Sustainability in financing for decarbonization is relatively nascent, and new capability would have to be developed to bring together efforts on net zero transition and investment strategy. And this is the area that GCNS here in Singapore is focusing on in the capability development on sustainable financing and investments.
So, Dirk, just picking up from that, with COP27 on the horizon, the operation of carbon markets is high on the agenda. We know that. So what needs to happen in Egypt to scale up and support liquid carbon markets?
The most important things that are going to happen may be a little more boring than they were in Glasgow, because in Glasgow we were looking at sort of the high-level policy elements that are needed to make those systems work. But in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think we're going to be looking at infrastructure, like is the market infrastructure available at a UN level for countries that want to use it? Or many of us in the private sector have been working with the World Bank on a climate warehouse that is also providing kind of digital infrastructure for connecting market systems. When you make an emissions trade from one country to another, it will need to be authorized by the country, and we need to learn what an authorization looks like. And then it will need to travel through this digital infrastructure to an account in another country, and you'll need an approval there to bring it in. Right now, that seems a little mysterious because we haven't done it in the new Paris system, but it's not miles away from getting done. So I'm hoping that when we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, we'll have progress to report on the UN's work on the infrastructure. I'm hoping that they will have appointed the new executive board that's going to, or executive body that's going to supervise the new trading mechanism that's set up at a UN level. And then really the most important thing is going to be hearing from countries on how they plan to utilize it. So Singapore, for example, is a country that's leaning forward and trying to provide services to help connect markets in not just Asia, but around the world. Colombia has sent signals about its intentions for improving the performance of its market system to be more influential in the region. The European Union is tightening its targets and is also beginning to lay out a removal strategy for what kind of carbon credits from removal approaches, whether it be in agriculture or forestry or in technological engineered approaches, how are those going to be utilized in the system of the EU ETS and getting companies to net zero? So hearing from countries on what their plans are for using the international aspects, international trading elements of Article 6, I think is going to be probably the most important thing for the private sector to see. And that could happen in Sharm el-Sheikh, but typically it'll happen on the road there. We'll hear more and more as countries develop those plans, and we get to sort of see the strategies emerge for what nations want to do in cooperation with each other. Now, I just want to underscore in closing, really what Article 6 is about is what we choose to do together. The market elements do bring together in very stark way those kind of cooperative approaches, but it doesn't have to be through a market. You can also cooperate in other ways, non-market approaches. But any analysis that you see on what it takes to get to net zero really ends with, we need to do this together because nobody can do it alone. Going it alone is just going to be a very rare thing for any individual country or any individual company to get to net zero. We're going to need cooperation at a scale that we've never seen before. So I think that's what markets and what carbon pricing systems can do, is stimulate really productive ways of working together.
Dirk Forrester, Svita and Go, thank you so very much for being with us today. It's been such valuable insight. Well, as we continue today's theme, it brings me great pleasure to introduce and indeed pass the baton to Mari Pangestu for our Leaders panel, where she's going to take an in-depth look into how we can incentivise climate action through carbon markets. Mari, welcome back to Innovate for Climate.
Thank you, Anita. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Mari Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank, and I'm really delighted to be back at the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, CPLC, plenary at Innovate for Climate again this year. Welcome to this panel discussion on how we can incentivize climate action through carbon markets. This is a very important subject because, as we know, we are already over the tipping point on the climate crisis, and we really need to have action at scale and with urgency, and carbon markets can play a very important role. In previous sessions of this plenary, we had already a fantastic lineup of speakers who shared how they are using and implementing carbon pricing to help them reach their decarbonization targets. We also heard from the last few speakers on the role and potential of carbon pricing to scale up carbon markets. Now, I'm looking forward to hearing about the innovations and the practical experience of implementing these policies from the pioneers. I'm particularly looking forward to diving deep into the opportunities that as yet are unexplored and the challenges that as yet remain unsolved on carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets. Joining us today for this discussion, we are delighted to have Nicole Wilk, Head of Division International Financing for the Transformation International Market Mechanisms, Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Germany, and Rachel Kite, Co-Chair, Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative. So let's kick off. Let me first go to Nicole Wilkie and ask you a question. Nicole, we are really thrilled to have you join us today. The first question for you is, Germany has been a long-time strong advocate for a functioning global carbon market. From Germany's perspective, why is Article 6 under the Paris Agreement so important, and what do the rules agreed at COP26 mean for governments, especially with regard to ensuring just transition in climate action? Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you for inviting me for this really interesting discussion. I think I'll start off by acknowledging how important it was that we managed to finalize the rulebook in Glasgow, because it is a fundament for what we are going to do next. It's the basic decisions for cooperation, and they are now available for us for the implementation phase, actually, which we are looking forward. There is still some technical work that is needed, obviously, and we acknowledge how important that work is, and to establish that kind of infrastructure. But it gives us the opportunity, actually, where we see carbon markets, and that is that they can and should contribute to international climate protection substantially. Having said that, obviously, since we have now set the rules, implementation is at the core of what we need to look at. And that also is true for carbon markets. They also need to be implemented now. In order for that to happen, one thing most likely, or I think there is a broad consensus that is needed, that is capacity building for all, because it's a new area which we will have to look into, and we look forward to that kind of work. We see that all parties to the Paris Agreement have now made their own mitigation commitments in their NDCs. The key question they have asked themselves now is, how do they implement those targets? How do they integrate all of this into their low carbon or low emissions development strategies, and how do they get to climate neutrality? And then also the question is, how can all of that contribute and be transferred into ITMOs? So in that element, which is part of the carbon markets. For us in Germany, because we think capacity building is so important, we have set up quite some initiatives and activities to make sure that really countries can build the capacity to use the cooperative mechanisms, and that they also identify how they can be transformative and contribute to sustainable development. Some of the examples from Germany, what we are currently doing is that we support the West and Eastern African Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance and the UNFCCC through its regional collaboration centers. And that is in fostering exchange and helping countries to get ready for the implementation of Article 6 activities. Our newest project is the supporting preparedness for Article 6 cooperation, which we do with 4 countries in Colombia, Pakistan, Thailand, Zambia. And that is all focused towards the strategic use of Article 6. We also support the work of the Sustainable Development Initiative to promote strong sustainability standards and to promote synergies and avoid trade-offs by bringing together climate and sustainable development goals. For us, Article 6 can also offer opportunities to pilot innovative approaches in order to drive the decarbonization in specific sectors. We support, for instance, the preparation of a climate change mitigation program to introduce energy efficiency and F-gas-free ACs in southern African regions. As a last point, I also want to build on the bridge to the voluntary carbon markets. The rules which we have established under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement also offer the participants in those voluntary carbon markets a clear standard for using emission reductions. All private stakeholders should take on an active role and only use emission reductions that have been verified as meeting the newly created UN standards.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your remarks. And I totally agree with you. Implementation, capacity building for countries to use Article 6. And your last point about the voluntary carbon markets, I think that's still something that needs a lot more work, but certainly it has been discussed as a source of financing for climate action. Now over to you, Rachel, the co-chair of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or VCMI, which I understand was launched in June last year and has just released its major reports on claims guidance and voluntary carbon markets access to strategies last month. Can you tell us about the VCMI and what it hopes to achieve, and how can international voluntary carbon market support countries to achieve their net zero goals, and how to address issues around integrity? Over to you, Rachel.
Well, thank you very much, Mari. So over the last, the voluntary carbon markets are not a new phenomenon. They've been around for a couple of decades, and obviously the World Bank Group has been at the heart of a lot of the experimentation and innovation within the voluntary markets. But over the last 2 years in particular, as more and more companies have started working on science-based pathways or transitions to net zero linked to their own claims to be Paris-aligned, and as many low-income countries and middle-income countries that can produce carbon credits really desperately need new revenue streams in order to help them protect nature, in order to for them to help build out their adaptation and resilience strategies, as well as to meet their own growth targets. The pressure on the voluntary market really developing has been quite intense from both, I think, the supply and the demand side. At the same time, we've seen growing alarm, I think, in parts of civil society and across the scientific community and others, that many of the activities within the voluntary markets are pure greenwashing, in that they are not helping the market achieve its perspective. And I think this is an important perspective from the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, but also another initiative which is working on the supply side principles, which is called the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. So lots of acronyms. I think we're all united, especially since Glasgow, with the idea that the voluntary carbon markets have to be purposeful. And the voluntary carbon market has to help us move more quickly towards the 1.5 goal that we have, towards net zero, and has to provide that steady stream of revenue to places that need it and to communities that need it. So if the voluntary carbon market is to be purposeful, then we need discipline and we need a commitment to integrity, not only by the issuers of credits, but, and this is the work that VCMI is focused on, by companies that want to be in the voluntary carbon markets, which means that we need companies to be able to articulate what their strategy is towards net zero, how they're going to reduce their emissions, how they're going to remove emissions, and then why they would enter into the voluntary carbon market once they've, as part of that strategy, but not as a sort of first thing that they would do. There has to be an emissions reduction, science-based emissions reduction plan in place. And so what we're doing with the guidance that we're issuing, and I'm happy to get into the detail of some of that guidance further on in this discussion, is try to develop guidance which is interoperable with lots of the other guidance that companies have to use, from the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, from the Science Based Target Initiative, SBTI, and from the GHG protocols. So companies have to be able to knit all of this together. It's very complicated. We hear from companies that life is getting even more complicated. We're writing a global guidance, so it means there needs to be an on-ramp, and companies that aspire to being net zero but aren't net zero now, or not even clear about how they will get to net zero, need to be able to enter into an on-ramp to the voluntary carbon markets. We're not trying to write a guidance for a standard that nobody can meet until they have achieved their net zero. We're really trying to offer guidance that helps companies measure their progress towards achievements. It's not a verification of a commitment in broad terms. So I'll stop there, but the idea is that we will need integrity on the demand side. Companies, as they work in the voluntary carbon markets, need to be able to back up their claims and need to be able to show how the voluntary carbon markets is adding to the reductions they're already securing in their business models. And we need integrity on the supply side, the quality of credits, And then those two forms of integrity have to come together.
Thanks so much, Rachel. You're absolutely right. Glasgow showed increased commitment by private sector, but then how do we actually implement that? You've provided some really great guidelines as to a path moving forward on making sure we can have functioning voluntary carbon markets. Now let's explore a little bit further into the voluntary carbon markets. Over to you, Nicole. Germany has set a target for becoming climate neutral by 2045. How do you see the international voluntary carbon markets support the transformation to a carbon neutral and climate resilient development? And how can the private sector help to drive national ambitions?
Thank you. Again, an excellent question. We know that large investments are needed to finance the transformation to a carbon neutral and climate resilient development. And private finance definitely will play a key role here. And voluntary commitments, in our view, can help to live up to what we agreed to in Paris and bridge the emissions gap that still exists. The voluntary carbon markets can do two different things in our view. They can help to raise ambition on top of the NDCs, or they can help countries to meet their NDCs. And that is both very important, but it needs to be separated from each other to be very clear of which kind of instrument we are talking about. On the first one, the one where it is on ambition on top of the NDCs, we think that it is important that these credits can be used for compensation and for neutrality claims. And that means that corresponding adjustments should be used. In our view, only in this case, they can be a claim for a compensation or a neutrality. Otherwise, there would be double counting, and the atmosphere would not see the reductions the stakeholders claim they would do. If they are used to fulfill the country's NDCs, then obviously the Article 6 rules apply. And there it's different. Then it's more of a finance contribution which helps to fulfill the NDCs. Allow me to emphasize that we think that both claims have an asset and are valuable for the climate, but they need to be differentiated. I can't reiterate that more and over again. Compensation claims which corresponding adjustments will most likely not be as cheap as the contribution claims, and host countries will have to agree. The procedures have to be designed, but it's the only way to harness a real add-on on top of the existing country ambition. And in our view, companies should be encouraged to go this way. And I think that is really where they can make a big difference, which is needed. But they also can be supported, obviously, to help support the fulfillment and the achievement of the NDCs. But we have to be very clear in our communication which of the two aims we are looking at. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We are getting a lot of questions from developing countries on how they can really, what's the link with NDC. So hopefully we can continue to explore how this can really be helping countries with their achievement of the NDCs. Over to you, Rachel. The other part of the discussion we've been having with a lot of our developing countries, partners especially, is this notion of we want you to achieve climate action, but there's a transition there, and it is about how to achieve affordable, socially fair, and just transition. And this is really important for developing countries and emerging economies. So, and it's a cost in many cases. So what role can voluntary carbon markets play in accelerating a just transition by channeling finance flows to decarbonizing action, especially in developing countries?
So it's a great question, and I feel that in Glasgow something new happened in the debate, because we had developing countries extremely articulately, of course, laying out that the cost of capital is too high, finance isn't flowing, public commitments not being upheld by Part 1 countries, and lots of people talking about trillions of dollars being mobilized, but that's not flowing down into off-grid electric build out in the Sahel, for example. And then we saw, on the first day of Davos, more private jets on the tarmac in Glasgow airport. It felt like Davos, and the private finance had arrived, and private finance was committing to net zero. And of course, famously, 450 organizations, 130 trillion, GFANZ was a big announcement, and yet it doesn't match. Now, there's another call, Murray, that we should have about the role of the Bretton Woods institutions in making that match happen. But I think that's why there's so much interest that the voluntary carbon markets can begin to build out, and not to be hyperbolic about it. Obviously, there are an analysis from Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others that believe that the market could be, in the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the decade. But I think we have to steadily move there, and so I think that's why there's been so much work now being done by so many different stakeholders and partners on integrity. Because if we can get integrity right, this market can grow. If we try to grow it without integrity, things are going to come to a crashing halt. There will be less trust from indigenous peoples and communities that need the resources, less trust by young people in the developed world who think that companies are just saying whatever they need to say in order to get an ability to sell a carbon neutral product in the market. So I think, let's get the integrity right, then the market starts growing. And then what countries want to do with the resources that come in, I think this is going to be a very important part of it. And UNDP and the bank and others have got a very important role in helping countries build out the conversation about what to do with the revenue. It isn't just about protecting forests, although that's very important for forest nations. It isn't just about seagrasses and wetlands for blue carbon for the countries that have that resources. It's also then directing resources into community resilience, whether that be, as long as it's additional, whether that be clean energy or clean water, etc. So where are we coming out on integrity? I think a couple of key design criteria that we think are important to help this market grow and have that desired effect of channeling resources. As I said, we're focusing on corporate achievements, not commitments. So you may have committed to something, but what are you honestly achieving? We have to understand that this has to be a process of continual improvement, because there's no company today, I think, that could legitimately say that it is already operating as a net zero company. Some do, but I would like to see that. It has to be practical, it has to be robust, it has to be able to stand up against scrutiny. It has to be incentivizing companies to do better. We are in transition, as you've said. So the point is that you may have a net zero goal for 2030 or 2040 or whenever. You have benchmarks of progress. We have to allow you to participate in that voluntary carbon market as you make progress towards your goal. And then I think there is also a need for some understanding of the different kinds of companies that are going to want to participate in this market. So are you net zero at an enterprise level, or could you have parts of your enterprise that are going faster than others? So if you were a conglomerate and you had a retail part of your business, maybe that could be at net zero before your steel business or your power business. I mean, how would you think about that? And then even though at the enterprise level you might not be net zero, can you have a net zero product? So could you sell net zero sparkling water even though you also make detergent? I mean, these are, and can you actually make a claim that that's carbon neutral in the supermarket? And could anybody actually trust that? And then could the revenues from that actually go to communities that need it? So all of this, a hierarchy of claims, a way to provide an on-ramp, a way to write this so that it can be global, so companies from all over the world can participate. And then, how do you, I think, help companies fit this into the other things that they need to do in order to be competitive in the current world? So if we can agree around a practice of integrity, it's not just a principle, it has to be practiced by companies. We believe that finance could start flowing especially to those countries that are further along in their readiness. And those are the countries that have done a lot of work and are doing a lot of work now to understand how they would use revenues from voluntary carbon markets, how they would approach the voluntary carbon market themselves.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I picked up very important adjectives and words there. Integrity, practical and robust, so that we can really make the 130 trillion available to developing countries with their financing needs. Let me now turn to Nicole and to ask you that you know about G7. We know that Germany is a chair of G7 this year. How do you see the G7 addressing carbon markets in order to translate the IPCC message on the closing window of opportunity to help the way for success at COP27?
This, again, is a very, very good question. G7 our presidency is not over. We are in full negotiation right now with our G7 partners on the final outcomes of our presidency. But what I can say right now is definitely that we want to build on existing commitments from the G7, but also on what, in addition, the energy, climate, and environment ministers meeting communique can contribute to this. To keep 1.5 within reach, countries have to revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets in their NDCs. And we said that in Glasgow, definitely, in order for all of us to align with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. We, as the G7, also have to signal enhanced ambition, and we suggest to do so by strengthening sectoral targets, by adopting non-CO2 sub-targets, and accelerating implementation. Furthermore, we need to send strong signal of cooperation to the G20 and developing and emerging economies. We continue to strive to achieve the collective commitment to reach the $100 billion US dollar goal by 2023 at the last, and collective as developed countries double our adaptation finance. In regard to accelerate the implementation of climate action, we as the presidency suggest to highlight the role of carbon markets and carbon pricing that enable to align financial flows with the Paris Agreement and promote just transition. Moreover, the G7 partners should strive for an increase of the goal share of the greenhouse gas emissions covered by carbon pricing. This includes that national governments should lead by example and use carbon shadow prices for public procurement and investments. Pertaining to Article 6, the G7 partners will stress the importance of strengthening support for capacity building to developing countries for the swift and robust implementation of Article 6. The objectives of the carbon market platform should be reviewed in light of the new guidance and the rules for Article 6. We would also like to send a signal to the private sector to encourage to set out and undertake aggressive mitigation strategies that target net zero emissions by 2050. Prioritize reductions in greenhouse gas across the full value chain, and to use Article 6 carbon credits for voluntary offsetting to enhance transparency and avoid all forms of double counting.
Thank you. And finally, last question to you, Rachel. Article 6 text from Glasgow remains ambiguous on the treatment of credits for voluntary carbon markets and on the role that host governments can or should play. And this has been lots of questions from our developing countries and asking how this will actually work. So what would you like to see happen on this at COP27, since this is supposed to be a COP of implementation? Over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, so I think it's the way that I try to sort of describe it is that we have a landing zone, right? So the landing zone is, robust, effective carbon pricing, with regulated carbon markets, ideally globally, but if not globally, then in more jurisdictions than we have now, and that the voluntary carbon markets provide a glide path to that landing zone. That isn't to say that at the point where we have regulated carbon markets, you don't need a voluntary carbon market. You can still have voluntary carbon market activity. There may be a desire for that and a role for that. But everything that we do as we try to build integrity into the voluntary carbon markets would be with an eye to the fact that there should be more regulated carbon pricing around the world. So if that's the agree or disagree, but if that's sort of the broad framing of this, then it's very important that at COP27 we have a really robust discussion outside of the negotiating halls. I think there continues to be the need of the supervisory body and the other pieces of the Article 6 agreement that need to be worked on by negotiators in the UN. But I think around that, really robust discussion about the work that's been done up to now in trying to put guardrails and scaffolding around the voluntary carbon markets to make sure that they work. A conversation about how and information and sharing of best practice around how you would conceive of that in terms of its contribution to your NDC, what you would need to do in order to make sure that that's fully understood, how the different proposals and guidelines which are being issued this summer are treating the issues of corresponding adjustments, how we think about making sure that there's no double claiming where that's a problem. So I think that it's about familiarizing, it's about sharing best practice, it is about making sure that there's more and more conversation between countries that want to benefit from voluntary carbon markets and the companies that are building up their expertise. It's also, we will see emergence of all kinds of new exchanges, Singapore, India, Switzerland, there are many, London, many places are looking at becoming centers of carbon market activity and voluntary carbon market activity as well. So what I'm hoping is that Sharm el-Sheikh provides a place where all of this can be people can update themselves, people can discuss, we can look at what's working, what isn't, what is unclear, what needs to be made more clear. We are, I think, building the scaffolding for a new architecture, a new international economic and financial architecture in advance of global regulation. And so this isn't the only place where I think that conversation takes place, but because it's on African soil, I think it's even more important this year that it do so.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a good note to end on. And thank you, everyone, for your inputs and insights. It's really been a fascinating discussion. We talked about the key issues of making carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets work, and what are the benefits and challenges. And it's really remarkable that the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition was founded 6 years ago, and how much we have achieved and discussed, but how much more we still need to do. So I just want to close by three main messages. I think everybody emphasized the importance of carbon markets to enable countries, especially developing countries, to reach global climate goals. It's part of the needed financing at scale that will be needed. But as we heard here and from previous discussions, we need to really look at carbon pricing instruments and approaches, and the whole gamut of these instruments, and that in many cases they will have an important role to play in broader climate strategy and the development agenda to achieve the just, affordable and sustainable transition to a net zero future. And all of you mentioned the importance of standards and guidance and achieving integrity in carbon markets on both the supply and the demand side. And it is a process. And I think I'll just use Rachel's description. We are building the scaffolding and the architecture for all this. And it's a process that we all should be in together, sharing best practices. And I'm learning as we are doing this. And I hope that all of you will continue to be with us to discuss this. And multilateral development banks need to also work with countries on the capacity, as well as what the resources will be used for to achieve climate and development. So thank you again for joining us today. If you still have questions on this topic, please submit them on the community page that we have. And some of these questions will be answered tomorrow by Jürgen Vogele, our Vice President for Sustainable Development, during the closing segment. So thank you again, and back to you, Anita.
Thank you so much, Mari Pangestu, for leading and moderating such an in-depth look into today's headline topic. And thank you to all of our panellists for making that such an informative discussion. We can cross over to Ottawa now, to Catherine McKenna, Canada's former Minister for Environment and Climate Change and chair of the high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitment of non-state entities, for some closing remarks. Catherine, it's over to you.
Well, it's really great to be joining the World Bank's Innovate for Climate conference. I used to be co-chair of the World Bank's Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. And I know we've had some really awesome speakers talking about the importance of carbon pricing. But look, from my perspective, and this is what I said to Canadians when we landed a price of pollution, a carbon pollution across Canada, is it can't be free to pollute. And by putting a price on pollution, as you all know, that creates the right incentives. It creates the incentives for folks, for businesses to save money by finding ways to reduce carbon pollution. And we have a huge challenge. We know that we need to be reducing emissions by 45% by 2030, and carbon pricing is hugely important. And a shout out to everyone who's part of this, because what I love about the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition is it includes governments, also includes regional governments, cities, but it includes businesses and financial institutions and the not-for-profit sector. And the reality is everyone has to be part of the solution. So great to see all of you there. Great to see that everyone is advocating about the importance for a price on pollution. We've seen some really great progress around the world. As I say, in Canada, we have a price on pollution. It's going up to $170 by 2030. So that's significant, and it will drive ambition, it'll drive innovation, and it'll drive growth and clean growth, which is what we need. I'm also very focused on carbon pricing because that's key to how we're going to drive to net zero by 2050, but we really need to see action now. And so carbon pricing is critical to driving to net zero. And certainly, I hope that all of you will be advocating about the importance of carbon pricing. And as I say, non-state actors are key. So the focus of this task force that I've been tasked to chair by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is really focused on how do we ensure that commitments by businesses, companies, by financial institutions, investors, and by cities and regions are real and credible, that folks are held accountable for commitments, that they're driving ambition, that the commitments are done in a transparent way, and that we're seeing immediate action because we just do not have time. So I certainly want to thank all of you climate leaders. It is important that we have real leadership. I saw that in Canada where folks stepped up to support carbon pricing. Unusual suspects. We had provinces, we had businesses, we had a whole range of folks that said it was really important that it not be free to pollute. So once again, thank you to everyone who's participating. Thanks to all the members of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. Grow your membership. When I joined, we had no Canadian businesses. So I said, I'm going to go get some. And I was able to get, I think we got, maybe a dozen or 20 companies to join on. And we need more folks. The more, the merrier. But certainly wishing all of you well. And let's just keep on acting for the climate.
Catherine, thank you so much. And that message, grow your membership, will ring in our ears. That brings us now to the end of day 2. And you can now take a break before the workshops start. The marketplace is also open, so do take advantage and make time to pop in. I'm going to be back tomorrow for the 3rd and final day of Innovate for Climate, where we're going to be focusing on finance. And boy, do we have a great lineup of speakers for you. The subject they're going to be grappling with is financing transformative climate action. So that's tomorrow, and you don't want to miss it. For now, though, enjoy the rest of your day and keep joining in the discussion. Have a good one.